The first music leaves no ruin behind. It does not sink into soil like a stone blade, survive in ash like a burned seed, or wait inside a cave for archaeologists to uncover it. It passes through the air, touches a body, and disappears. Somewhere in the deep cold of the Ice Age, long before any surviving flute was drilled from bone, someone may have shaped a tone with the throat, answered it with another, and discovered that sound could hold people together for a little longer than silence. A hand might have struck a thigh in steady time. Feet may have marked a pulse against packed earth. Breath may have become rhythm before rhythm ever became an instrument. None of this can be excavated directly. The first melody, if there was such a thing, vanished at the instant it was made, in the darkness before recorded history. That absence is the beginning of the mystery. Archaeology can recover objects, but music is not an object. It is an action, a pattern, a relationship between breath, movement, expectation, and memory. A flute survives only because bone can endure. A drum of hide may rot, a wooden clapper may decay, a reed pipe may collapse into nothing. A song leaves even less. What remains in the ground is therefore not the birth of music, but the narrow fraction of musical life that happened to be made from durable materials and then buried under favourable conditions. By roughly 40,000 years ago, and perhaps several millennia earlier, humans were already making sophisticated musical instruments. Music itself was almost certainly older, but its earliest history survives only in fragments. Imagine a small group gathered in a limestone shelter while winter presses against the valley outside. Smoke rises unevenly. Animal fat burns in a shallow lamp. There are no written words, no preserved scores, no names for scales that can reach us. Yet the people present possess voices, lungs, hands, and a nervous system exquisitely sensitive to timing. One person begins a pulse, another anticipates the next beat. Others adjust their movements almost without conscious effort. This capacity to synchronize is easy to overlook. Separate bodies become coordinated through sound. Breathing aligns, attention narrows, repetition creates expectation, and expectation creates tension. A pause can suddenly matter. A return can feel inevitable. Before we go deeper, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, if this is the kind of history and mystery you enjoy. The story ahead is not about the moment music was invented, because no surviving evidence can reveal such a moment. It is about the point at which music finally becomes visible to archaeology, and about everything that must have existed before that visibility began. The human body is the oldest plausible instrument in the story. The voice can glide between pitches, repeat short patterns, imitate animals, signal over distance, soothe, warn, and bind a group through shared timing. Hands can clap, fingers can snap, palms can strike skin, wood, stone, or hollow bone. Feet can stamp, breath can whistle. Even movement without deliberate sound can create a pulse when several people act together. Scholars still debate how far back specifically musical behavior extends, because the boundary between music, language, emotional vocalization, and rhythmic display is not easy to draw. A repeated call may be functional, a lull may be soothing, a chant may carry words, or may work without them. Modern categories may not fit their social life. Comparative evidence adds another layer, though it must be handled carefully. Chimpanzees have been observed drumming on tree roots and buttresses in patterned ways, and recent research suggests that some of this drumming is rhythmic rather than random, with differences between populations. This does not prove that the common ancestor of humans and chimpanzees made music in any modern sense. It does show that sensitivity to timing, repetition, and percussive display did not appear from nothing at the threshold of Homo sapiens. Evolution tends to modify older capacities rather than create every complex behavior from a blank beginning. The roots of musicality may therefore reach into systems originally shaped for movement, communication, emotion, social display, and coordination. Still, no single explanation fully accounts for why humans became so intensely musical. Music is costly in time and attention. It requires energy to make and concentration to follow, yet it appears in every known human society, woven into ritual, courtship, mourning, work, celebration, identity, and care. Some researchers emphasize social bonding, arguing that shared rhythm helps larger groups feel connected beyond immediate family ties. Others focus on coordination, memory, emotional regulation, communication between caregivers and infants, sexual selection, or the display of skill. These ideas are not mutually exclusive. Music may never have had one original function. It may have emerged gradually from several overlapping behaviors until sound became a powerful social technology. What survives in the record suggests that, by the time humans entered the caves of the Swabian Jura, that technology was already highly developed. The oldest secure instruments do not look like crude first attempts. They required planning, material knowledge, controlled cutting, careful perforation, and an understanding learned through practice. That matters because complexity at first appearance usually hints at a longer invisible history. The first preserved boat is unlikely to have been the first boat. The earliest surviving woven fibre is unlikely to mark the first act of weaving. In the same way, the oldest known flute is almost certainly not the first time a human being discovered that controlled breath could turn a hollow tube into patterned sound. The evidence remains incomplete because preservation is selective and time is ruthless. Bone survives better than bark. Ivory survives better than stretched skin. Caves protect what open landscapes destroy. A single region may appear unusually important not because everything began there, but because geology, climate, and excavation allowed its traces to endure. This is one of archaeology's quietest dangers. Survival can imitate origin. The places with the best evidence can seem like the places where history started, even when they are only where history remained visible. So the story begins not with a triumphant invention, but with a silence surrounding a handful of objects. Beyond that silence lies a vanished world of breathing, striking, humming, listening, and moving together. We cannot hear its songs. We cannot know whether they were gentle, repetitive, piercing, solemn, playful, or all of these at different moments. We do not know who led them, who answered, or whether anyone thought of them as a separate thing called music. But the body was ready, the social mind was ready, and the landscapes of the Ice Age were already full of rhythm wings beating overhead, hooves crossing frozen ground, water sounding inside stone, and human breath waiting to become more than breath. The breath waiting to become more than breath belongs to a world already in motion. Around 43,000 years ago, small groups of Homo sapiens begin to appear along the upper Danube, moving through a landscape that is neither empty nor stable. Valleys open and close with the seasons. Rivers carry meltwater through limestone country. Cold grasslands stretch between patches of woodland, and the animals that cross them include mammoths, reindeer, wild horses, bison, ibex, wolves, cave lions, and rhinoceroses adapted to bitter climates. The people entering this region do not arrive in a timeless wilderness. Neanderthal communities have lived across Europe for hundreds of thousands of years, and their final presence overlaps, at least broadly, with the arrival of modern humans. The exact nature of contact remains uncertain, but the continent is not a blank stage awaiting a new actor. These early Homo sapiens carry with them a cultural tradition archaeologists call the Aurignacian. The name comes from a site in France, but the material pattern appears across wide parts of Europe. It includes distinctive stone tools, worked bone and antler, personal ornaments, figurative carvings, and, in the Swabian Jura, musical instruments. Yet even the label can create a false sense of uniformity. The Aurignacian was not a single tribe, a single language, or one unchanging way of life. It was a broad archaeological pattern spread across thousands of years and enormous distances. What survives suggests networks of learning and exchange, but the evidence does not reveal how people named themselves or how closely neighbouring groups felt connected. The upper Danube offered both a corridor and a challenge. Its tributaries cut through the limestone uplands of what is now southwestern Germany, linking Central Europe with routes leading east and west. River valleys provided water, animal movement, shelter, raw materials, and recognizable paths through unfamiliar terrain. They also concentrated danger. Winters could be severe, food availability fluctuated, and rapid climatic shifts could transform productive ground into hostile country within generations. Around this time, Europe experienced Heinrich Stadial IV, a pronounced cold phase associated with major changes in North Atlantic conditions. Researchers still debate the precise timing of human movements relative to this event, but the oldest Aurignacian levels at Geyssenklustele appear to begin before or near its onset. Despite the phrase Ice Age, this was not a continent buried beneath one continuous glacier. Much of the Danube corridor was open steppe and tundra, windy and seasonally productive, a mosaic where herds moved over long distances and human groups followed opportunities rather than fixed borders. That chronology matters because it places music not at the comfortable end of adaptation, but close to a period of expansion into difficult environments. Radiocarbon dating of animal bones and other organic remains from Geyssenklustele has produced modelled ages reaching roughly 42 to 43,000 years ago. These dates do not mean that every artifact in the layer can be assigned a single exact birthday. Archaeological chronology is built from association samples, sediments, excavation records, chemical pre-treatment, and statistical models that estimate how layers accumulated through time. The result is a range of probability, not a date stamped onto the flute by its maker. Still, the pattern is strong enough to show that symbolic objects and musical technology were present astonishingly early in the Aurignacian occupation of Central Europe. This complicates an older story in which art and music appeared only after modern humans had settled securely in Europe. Instead, creativity seems to travel with them. Figurines, ornaments, and instruments occur near the beginning of their documented presence in the region, not after tens of millennia of local development. That does not prove these practices were invented along the Danube. They may have arrived as older traditions carried from elsewhere, or they may have developed through contact among dispersed groups moving across Eurasia. The archaeological record before this point is too fragmentary to decide. Survival can imitate origin here as easily as it does with music itself. Daily life in this landscape demands knowledge accumulated across generations. Hunters must understand migration routes, wind, snow, animal behavior, and the properties of stone. Gatherers must recognize seasonal plants, fuel, fibers, and medicines even when cold conditions reduce what is available. People maintain clothing stitched from hides, manage fire, care for tools, share food, and navigate valleys where storms or injury could quickly become serious. Children, when present in the archaeological imagination, belong within protected social groups learning skills through observation and participation. No community survives such conditions through individual brilliance alone. Cooperation is not an ideal, it is infrastructure. Music may have belonged to that infrastructure, though the evidence cannot tell us exactly how. A melody could make movement more coordinated, transform repetitive labor, mark identity, support memory, or create a sense of shared order when the world outside remained unpredictable. It may also have existed simply because patterned sound gave pleasure. Scholars often search for one adaptive function, but human practices rarely obey a single purpose. A flute could accompany a gathering one evening, signal from a distance on another, or remain silent for long periods because its significance depended on context now lost. The presence of Neanderthals makes the scene more complex. Genetic evidence shows that modern humans and Neanderthals interbred, but archaeology rarely provides a clear account of where particular encounters occurred or what people thought of one another. There is no secure basis for imagining constant conflict, peaceful alliance, or cultural replacement as a single universal pattern. Different contacts may have taken different forms. Nor can the disappearance of Neanderthals be explained by music. The old suggestion that symbolic culture gave Homo sapiens an automatic advantage is too simple. Population size, mobility, ecology, disease, climate, social networks, and chance all remain part of the discussion. What can be said is that the newcomers entering the upper Danube carried unusually visible forms of symbolic behavior. Small ivory figures gave durable shape to animals and imagined beings. Ornaments made identity portable. Flutes turned breath into controlled pitch. Together, these objects imply communities in which technical knowledge and shared meaning were closely connected. A mammoth tusk was not only raw material, a bird bone was not only refuse. Both could be transformed through planning into objects whose value exceeded immediate survival. As the valleys narrowed beneath limestone cliffs, the people of the Orination repeatedly returned to caves and rock shelters. Some offered shelter, some access to raw materials, and some may have become places remembered for reasons that cannot be measured. Inside their sediments, ash, broken tools, animal bones, carved ivory, and fragments of flutes accumulated in layers. Millennia later, those layers would allow archaeologists to see a moment when human expansion, climatic instability, visual art, and music converged. The songs themselves vanished, but the route toward them had entered the stone valleys of the Danube. The stone valleys of the upper Danube do not hold one cave but a constellation of them, scattered across the Ag and Lone valleys like chambers in a broken underground map. Hohlefels, Geisenklösterle, Zirgenstein, Vogelherd, Hohlenstein, Stadel, and Bockstein form an exceptional Ice Age landscape. But the people who entered them would not have thought in terms of a heritage zone. They knew roots, water, shelter, animal paths, smoke, darkness, and the memory of return. Each cave had its own shape and practical value. Some opened widely toward the valley, others narrowed quickly into shadow. Some became places where food was processed, stone was worked, ivory was carved, and tools were repaired. To describe them only as shelters would be too simple. They were parts of a lived landscape, repeatedly visited and layered with many activities. The Ark Valley contains Hohle Fels, Geissenklösterle, and Zergenstein. The Lone Valley holds Vogelherd, Hohlensteinstadel, and Bockstein. Between them lie open ground, slopes exposed to cold winds, and routes followed by animals and people. People could move through these valleys following herds or seasonal opportunities, returning to caves whose entrances were visible landmarks. Archaeologists find hearths, stone flakes, animal remains, worked bone, ornaments, and carved ivory within their deposits. The accumulation is not the record of a single dramatic occupation. It is the residue of many visits. A cave floor becomes an archive slowly, through ash brushed aside, bones discarded, objects lost, and sediments carried inward by weather and movement. Hohle Fels is among the most remarkable of these places. Its entrance leads into a vast chamber large enough to hold a substantial gathering, though size alone does not reveal how it was used. Excavations have produced figurative art, personal ornaments, tools, and musical instruments from orination layers. The cave's name means hollow rock, a simple description for an extraordinary archive. Yet its importance did not end with the famous discoveries of the early 21st century. Excavation continues, and each new season adds pieces to the same problem: what kind of social world could produce so many technically demanding and symbolically charged objects so early? In July 2026, researchers announced the discovery of 2 small bird figurines carved from mammoth-ivory in Aurigation deposits at Hohle Fels. Roughly 40,000 years old, these figures do not prove a new musical practice, and it would be careless to connect them directly to the flutes found there. Still, they deepen the atmosphere of the place. The people who shaped wind instruments from bird bone also paid close attention to birds. They watched bodies, wings, profiles, and movement closely enough to translate them into ivory. Whether birds carried mythic meaning, practical meaning, aesthetic fascination, or several meanings at once remains unknown. What survives suggests an environment in which sound, image, material, and memory were all being transformed deliberately. Geissenklösterle offers a different but related window. Its deposits produced fragments of flutes made from bird bone and mammoth ivory. Alongside ornaments and other orination material, the cave is crucial not because it contains one perfect object, but because its stratigraphy helps anchor the chronology of early music in Central Europe. Here, the evidence is dispersed and incomplete, exactly as one would expect after more than 40 millennia of breakage, disturbance, burial, and excavation. A tiny perforated fragment may look unimpressive in isolation. In context, it can reveal a manufacturing tradition. Several fragments from different materials and levels imply repeated knowledge rather than accident. Vogelherd, in the Lone Valley, is better known for its small ivory animal carvings, including mammoths, horses, and big cats rendered with a control that still feels startling. Musical fragments from the wider Swabian Jura place this visual culture beside a sound-making tradition, though the two should not be fused into one imagined ceremony without evidence. The same caution applies to Hohlensteinstadel, where the famous lion-human figure emerged from fragments found deep in archaeological deposits. Such objects show that Aurigation people could sustain elaborate mental images, technical plans, and perhaps stories that extended beyond ordinary observation. They do not tell us what music accompanied those ideas, if any. The evidence remains incomplete, and the silence between categories must not be filled too easily. What the caves do show is concentration. Within a relatively limited region, early modern humans left instruments, figurines, ornaments, hearths, and tools in multiple locations. This pattern makes it difficult to treat music as an isolated curiosity. The flutes belong to communities already investing effort in portable art, body decoration, specialized technology, and repeated cave use. That does not mean every person played, carved, or wore the same objects. Skill may have varied widely. Some artifacts may have been rare possessions. Others may have circulated between groups. Scholars still debate how knowledge moved through these populations, but transmission is unavoidable. No one creates a sealed ivory flute by intuition alone without learning from failed attempts, observation, or inherited practice. The acoustics of these caves invite speculation, but they require restraint. Large chambers can carry sound differently from open air. Narrow passages alter resonance. Stone surfaces return echoes, while irregular walls scatter them. A note played near an entrance might behave differently from one sounded deeper inside, yet no instrument comes with a label identifying its performance space. The caves may have hosted music, but they were also work areas, shelters, storage places, and settings for activities now impossible to classify. It is tempting to call them concert halls because flutes were found there. That phrase projects a modern institution backward onto evidence that supports only a more modest conclusion. People brought sound-making objects into cave environments, whose acoustic properties they could hardly have failed to notice. Fire would have changed the experience further. Light did not flood a chamber evenly. It gathered near flames, moved across surfaces, and left surrounding darkness intact. Sound could travel beyond the visible group, reaching people whose faces could not be seen. Smoke, stone, breath, and echo would make even a simple tone feel different from the same tone in daylight. This does not prove ritual performance. It does show that music in such a place would have been spatial, shaped by where bodies stood and how far light extended. The Swabian caves therefore matter as more than containers for ancient objects. They preserve an ecosystem of behavior. In them, people cooked, worked, watched, learned, made images, discarded bones, carried ornaments, and occasionally lost or abandoned instruments that time would spare. Their deposits do not reveal a neat division between survival and expression. The same hands that cut meat could carve ivory. The same breath that warmed the body in winter could be directed across a flute's edge. Somewhere within these chambers, music crossed the threshold from an invisible human capacity into durable material, and the stone began to remember what the air could not. The stone had remembered fragments, not the sound itself. At Hola Fells, the object that would restore part of that lost voice did not emerge from the sediment as a complete instrument. It appeared in pieces pale, narrow, easily mistaken for ordinary splinters of animal bone. 12 fragments were eventually recognized as belonging together. When joined, they formed most of a slender flute made from the radius bone of a griffon vulture, a large bird whose hollow wing bones offered an unusually suitable natural tube. 5 finger holes ran along its body, and near one end 2 deep V-shaped notches created the blowing edge. It was not a vaguely perforated bone that might have produced sound by accident. It was a deliberately engineered aerophone. Its discovery changed the scale of the argument. Earlier fragments from the Swabian Jura had already suggested musical instrument production in the Aurignacian, but the Hohlefels flute was unusually complete and technically legible. Archaeologists could see not only that it had been played, but how much planning lay behind its construction. The maker first needed the right raw material. Griffon vultures were enormous birds, with wings broad enough to ride rising air above the valleys. Their bones were light because flight rewards reduced weight, yet strong enough to resist stress. A long wing bone therefore provided something rare, a naturally hollow tube with enough length for several finger holes and enough structural integrity to survive careful modification. Finding such a bone was only the beginning. The surface had to be cleaned and prepared. Soft tissue and joints were removed. The shaft was scraped and smoothed. The ends were shaped without splitting the thin walls. Finger holes had to be opened at useful positions, each one large enough to alter the effective air column, but not so large that the instrument became difficult to control. The blowing end demanded even greater precision. Air passing across a sharp edge can set the air inside a tube vibrating, but the angle and shape matter. Too blunt or irregular, and the response becomes weak. The twin V-shaped notches at Hohlefels show purposeful shaping where the player directed breath. This was not a modern concert flute with keys, standardized pitch, or a written fingering chart. Its maker did not need mathematical acoustics in formal terms, but practical knowledge was essential. People understood through experience that tube length changes pitch, that open and closed holes reorganize the vibrating air column, and that small adjustments affect tone. That knowledge may have been learned through demonstration, imitation, repeated failure, or all three. The finished flute therefore preserves more than craftsmanship. It preserves a chain of teaching. A successful instrument is the endpoint of decisions that could be remembered and transmitted. The precise story of its deposition remains unknown. It may have broken during use, been discarded after damage, lost among occupation debris, or left behind when a group moved on. Archaeology cannot recover the last person who held it or the final sequence of notes played through it. Its fragments entered an Aurignacian layer with other traces of human activity. Scholars still debate the detailed formation of cave deposits. But the association of the flute with early modern human occupation is secure enough to make it one of the clearest surviving witnesses to Ice Age music. Recognition in the laboratory was as important as excavation. Bone fragments do not announce their original function. Their surfaces must be examined for cut marks, scraping, polish, perforation, fracture patterns, and deliberate shaping. Pieces separated in the ground may be found at different times or locations. Reconstruction is both physical and intellectual. When the 12 fragments were fitted together, a broken sequence became an object again. The holes aligned. The shaft regained length. The notches at the blowing end made functional sense. What had looked like debris became evidence of controlled sound. Its age added another layer of astonishment. The flute came from early Aurignacian deposits generally placed at more than 40,000 years ago. Dating such an object requires caution. The bone itself was not simply assigned a perfect calendar date. Its age depends on stratigraphic position, associated radiocarbon measurements, excavation history, and comparison with the wider sequence at the cave. The safest conclusion is not that one exact day marks the birth of music, but that sophisticated wind instruments existed in southwestern Germany by the early Aurignacian, The evidence does not show the first musician. It shows that a musical tradition was already mature enough to leave complex equipment. The instrument's completeness also tempts the imagination. A player could cover and uncover holes, change breath pressure, adjust the angle of the mouth, and produce a sequence of pitches. Experimental replicas demonstrate that such flutes can create clear tones and melodic variation. Yet every reconstruction contains modern decisions. The replica maker chooses wall thickness where pieces are missing, reproduces an uncertain edge, selects a blowing method, and plays according to habits inherited from much later musical systems. The sounds are valuable because they test what the object can do. They are not recordings of what Aurignacian people actually did. There is no surviving melody, no notation, and no evidence that the 5 holes corresponded to a fixed scale in the modern sense. Finger combinations may have produced more notes than the number of holes suggests. Changes in breath could shift pitch. Partial covering could create further variation. The player may have used effects that modern experimenters have not considered. Music might have been repetitive and rhythmic, or fluid and ornamented. It may have accompanied voices, hand percussion, dance, storytelling, or nothing else at all. No single explanation fully accounts for the object's social use. Even so, the flute narrows the field of uncertainty. It proves that someone invested time in creating a device whose defining purpose was organized sound. The object was portable, fragile, and unnecessary for cutting meat, scraping hides, or making fire. Its value belonged to experience. That does not make it impractical. In human societies, shared attention, memory, identity, and emotion are practical forces. A melody can coordinate, reassure, distinguish one group from another, or transform an ordinary gathering into something remembered. The choice of vulture bone adds a final, quieter mystery. Perhaps it was selected only because its dimensions were ideal. Perhaps the bird carried associations now lost. Griffon vultures circle high above landscapes, appearing from great distances as moving points against the sky. Their bones, shaped by flight, became tubes for human breath. No evidence allows us to claim a symbolic connection between bird and music, but the transformation remains striking. An animal adapted to air yielded an instrument that depended on air. From a wing bone came a human-controlled voice, and from 12 silent fragments came the clearest surviving sign that the Ice Age had already learned to sing. The vulture bone flute reveals the finished achievement, but the more revealing story lies in everything that had to happen before a single note could emerge. A hollow bird bone is naturally tube-shaped, yet nature does not provide a ready-made instrument. The maker must first recognize possibility in an object that most people would see only as part of a carcass. That recognition is itself a form of knowledge, the understanding that a tube can hold a column of air. That air can be set into vibration, and that carefully placed openings can divide one continuous length into different pitches. Large bird bones offered practical advantages. Their walls were thin, their shafts long, and their interiors largely hollow. A swan or vulture wing bone could produce a usable tube without the enormous labour required to hollow ivory. But thin walls also created risk. Too much pressure could crack the shaft. A poorly placed cut might split the bone along its grain. The maker needed sharp stone tools, steady hands, and familiarity with how bone responds when scraped, sawn, pierced, and polished. The work was not merely decorative. Every cut altered the instrument's structural strength and acoustic behaviour. The first stage was selection. Not every bone was suitable. Length affected the range of possible pitches. Diameter influenced tone and air resistance. Curvature, damage, and wall thickness had to be considered. A fresh bone could be easier to work in some respects, but still required cleaning and preparation. Residual tissue had to be removed. The ends might need trimming. The exterior could be scraped to eliminate irregularities and create a surface that could be held comfortably. These actions left microscopic traces that archaeologists later distinguish from natural weathering or carnivore damage. Then came the finger holes. Their placement was the most obvious sign that the object was intended for controlled sound. Holes placed too close together would produce small pitch changes. Holes placed too far apart could be difficult to cover. Their diameter mattered as well. A small opening might respond differently from a wide one, and an uneven edge could affect airflow or comfort. The maker could not rely on a ruler marked in standardized units. Measurement may have been done with fingers, chords, repeated visual spacing, or remembered proportions. Small incisions near some holes have sometimes been interpreted as planning marks, but the evidence remains incomplete. They may relate to measuring, drilling, correction, or another stage of manufacture. They should not be called musical notation. Creating a hole in thin bone demanded control. One approach was to scrape and gouge gradually from the surface until the wall opened. Another was to rotate a pointed stone tool. The maker might work from both sides to reduce splintering. Experimental reconstructions show that a usable result can be achieved with Upper Paleolithic tools, but possible does not mean easy. Reproducing the technique requires patience, and failed attempts are common. A crack running from one opening could ruin hours of work. The surviving flutes therefore imply not only successful objects, but an invisible history of mistakes, corrections, and discarded pieces. The blowing end was equally important. Air must strike an edge at the right angle to generate a stable tone. On the Hohlfels flute, 2 V-shaped notches helped create the mouth area. The player probably directed air across one sharpened edge, though the exact lip position remains uncertain. Modern researchers contest several methods, but they cannot know which technique Aurignacian performers preferred. A small change in mouth angle can alter clarity, loudness, and pitch. Breath pressure can shift the tone further. The instrument was not a machine that produced one fixed result. It responded to the player's body. Once the tube and holes were complete, the maker may have refined the edges, tested the seal of each finger, and adjusted openings that produced weak or unstable tones. This process would have linked craftsmanship directly to listening. The maker had to hear whether the instrument worked. A hole could be enlarged, but not easily made smaller. Each correction carried risk. Practical acoustics therefore developed through feedback: cut, blow, listen, adjust. No theory of frequency was necessary. Yet the process embodied knowledge about vibration, resonance, and the consequences of changing the effective air column. Replicas demonstrate how much variation such an instrument can produce. 5 finger holes do not limit a flute to 5 notes. Different combinations create additional pitches, and partial covering can extend the range further. Changes in breath pressure may generate overblown tones. The player can alter attack, duration, and intensity. Even a simple sequence can become rhythmically complex through repetition and pause. Yet these demonstrations reveal capability, not repertoire. A modern performer brings assumptions about scales, phrasing, tuning, and musical progression. Those assumptions can slip unnoticed into every reconstruction. The safest conclusion is that Aurignacian players had access to a flexible melodic instrument. They could organize pitch intentionally and repeat patterns if they chose. Whether they used fixed scales is unknown. Whether two flutes played together is unknown. We do not know if instruments were tuned to one another, if individual players owned them, or if certain people specialized in performance. Scholars still debate how much social structure can be inferred from a small number of artifacts. The objects prove technical knowledge more securely than they prove any particular musical institution. Material choice may also have shaped sound. Bird species differ in bone size and geometry. Two flutes made from different shafts would not behave identically, even if their holes appeared similar. The tone of a reconstruction depends on how closely the original dimensions are preserved and on how missing areas are restored. Modern copies made from substitute materials can be useful, but they add another layer of uncertainty. A replica is an argument expressed in matter. It shows one plausible instrument, not the only instrument the ancient fragments could have formed. What survives in the record suggests that this craft was learned rather than improvised. Similar instruments appear at several Swabian Jura sites. Their makers understood a sequence of operations and selected materials suited to the task. Such knowledge could travel through observation, one person watching another choose a bone, mark a surface, open a hole, and test the first breath. Teaching may have been formal or casual. There is no way to know, but complex techniques persist only when communities remember them. The finished flute was therefore more than hollow bone. It contained decisions about anatomy, tools, spacing, airflow, and sound. It joined the body of a bird to the breath of a human and turned both into something neither could produce alone. Its melody has vanished, but the workmanship remains, preserving the quiet evidence that Ice Age music depended on disciplined hands as much as inspired breath. The discipline required to turn bird bone into music was considerable, but mammoth-ivory demanded something stranger. Bone offered a hollow shaft. Ivory did not. A tusk was dense, curved, and solid, built from layers that spiraled through one another. To make a flute from it, an Aurignacian craftsperson first had to imagine a tube where no tube existed. The finished instrument would depend on cutting, splitting, hollowing, aligning, perforating, joining, and sealing separate pieces so precisely that breath could travel through them without escaping. It was not simply a more difficult version of the bird-bone flute. It was a different technological problem. The raw material itself carried weight. Mammoth ivory was not easy to obtain casually. It came from one of the largest animals in the Ice Age landscape, whether through scavenging, access to carcasses, old tusks exposed by erosion, exchange, or direct procurement. Scholars still debate how Aurignacian communities acquired and circulated ivory, because the archaeological record rarely preserves the exact history of a tusk before it entered a cave. What is clear is that ivory was used in the Swabian Jura for figurines, ornaments, tools, and musical instruments. It belonged to a sophisticated material tradition. The maker likely began by cutting a long blank from the tusk. Because ivory follows the curve and internal structure of the tusk, the blank had to be chosen carefully. A poor section could split unpredictably, or produce walls too thin to survive further work. The blank was then divided lengthwise into two narrow halves. Each inner face had to be hollowed into a matching channel. This was painstaking labour. Stone tools could scrape, gouge, and carve the ivory, but every movement altered the eventual bore. If one channel became deeper or wider than the other, the halves might not align. If the walls were uneven, the instrument could become fragile. If the interior remained rough, airflow and tone might change. The two halves also had to preserve enough material along their edges to be joined securely. Once hollowed, they were brought together to form a tube. The seam then needed to be sealed. Researchers have proposed adhesives or binding systems based on natural substances, but the exact recipes remain uncertain. A poor seal would leak air and weaken the sound. Even tiny gaps could matter. The maker therefore needed an empirical understanding of airtightness long before anyone described pressure or resonance formally. Breath itself was the test. If the tube failed, the flaw became obvious. Only after the body of the flute had been created could the finger holes and blowing edge be refined. This sequence involved risk. Opening holes in a finished ivory tube meant cutting through walls that had already required extensive labour. A crack at this stage could destroy the instrument. The maker had to judge spacing, size, and alignment while protecting the seam. Each opening changed the effective length of the vibrating air column, and each adjustment could affect the rest. The work demanded planning across many steps, with no guarantee that the final object would respond as intended. That planning is one of the most important clues preserved by the ivory flutes. Their makers did not merely understand isolated actions, they understood a chain of dependent actions. The first cut was made in anticipation of the last note. The width of a blank affected the wall. The depth of the hollow affected the bore. The seam affected the seal. The holes affected pitch. A successful result required the craftsperson to hold the entire process mentally while working through its stages. What survives suggests a tradition in which technical memory was distributed across time, knowledge inherited, practiced, corrected, and passed onward. Experimental archaeology helps reveal the scale of the achievement. Modern researchers using stone tools and carefully selected ivory substitutes can reproduce the general sequence, but the process is slow and unforgiving. Joining the halves is especially difficult. A replica may look convincing yet fail acoustically because air escapes along the seam. Another may sound, but only after modern assumptions influence dimensions, adhesives, or finishing methods. These experiments do not recreate the past perfectly. They demonstrate that the ancient solution was feasible and required skill beyond casual improvisation. The ivory flute also complicates any idea that music arose only because humans found convenient natural tubes. Bird bone may have suggested the possibility of a wind instrument, but ivory shows deliberate expansion beyond that natural form. People wanted a flute enough to manufacture the tube itself. They invested time in creating an object whose primary value lay in controlled sound. That decision matters. It implies that music was important enough to justify labour that could otherwise have been directed toward tools, clothing, shelter, or food processing. Why choose ivory when bone was easier? The answer may have involved availability, durability, tone, prestige, symbolic meaning, or the desire to make instruments of a particular size. No single explanation fully accounts for the choice. Ivory may have produced acoustic qualities valued by performers. It may have been socially charged because of its connection to mammoths. It may simply have belonged to a craft tradition in which artisans were already comfortable transforming tusk into complex forms. The evidence cannot tell us whether ivory flutes were rare objects, special possessions, or ordinary instruments. Recent work has opened another unexpected path into this material. In 2026, researchers reported that ancient DNA could be recovered from Upper Paleolithic mammoth-ivory artifacts from Hohle Fels. The study does not reveal who made the flutes or where every tusk originated, and it does not directly reconstruct music. Its importance lies in showing that worked ivory may still preserve biological information, despite human handling an immense age. Future research could help distinguish animals, trace raw material movement, or clarify how communities accessed mammoth remains. A musical instrument may therefore carry two histories: the cultural history imposed by human hands and the biological history retained within the ivory. This possibility sharpens the image of Aurignacian craftsmanship. A tusk once grew slowly inside a mammoth moving across Ice Age terrain. After the animal died, part of that tusk entered a human network. It was transported, cut, split, hollowed, and sealed. Breath passed through it. Notes emerged. Then the instrument broke, was discarded, or disappeared into cave sediment. Tens of thousands of years later, researchers began reading not only its tool marks and perforations, but perhaps the genetic identity of the animal itself. The music is gone, yet the object remains crowded with information. It reveals planning, patience, material expertise, and a willingness to solve a problem nature had not solved in advance. The bird bone flute borrowed a tube from flight. The ivory flute manufactured one from solidity. In doing so, it shows that Ice Age music was not merely discovered in the world, it was engineered into being. The ivory flute proves how far Aurignacian craft could go, but it does not settle the question that follows every ancient instrument: which one is the oldest. The phrase sounds simple, as though archaeology were a race with a single finish line. In reality, age is distributed across fragments, layers, samples, and probability ranges. Hola Fels preserves one of the clearest and most complete early flutes. Yet Geisenklösterle may place musical instrument production in an even earlier archaeological context, reaching roughly 42 to 43,000 years ago. The evidence is powerful, but it does not behave like a birth certificate. Geisenklösterle lies in the Ach Valley, not far from Hola Fels, and its deposits contain a long sequence of human occupation. Within Aurignacian layers, archaeologists recovered fragments of flutes made from bird bone and mammoth ivory. Some pieces are small enough that their significance becomes visible only through careful comparison. A section with a perforation, a shaped edge, or a longitudinal join may preserve just one part of an instrument. Alone, it can look modest. Together with similar finds and the surrounding stratigraphy, it becomes evidence for a broader tradition of music making. The chronology rests largely on radiocarbon dating of organic material from the archaeological layers. Bone, charcoal, and other remains can preserve radioactive carbon whose decay provides an estimate of age. But the process is not as direct as placing an artifact into a machine and receiving an unquestionable number. Samples may contain contamination. Earlier excavation methods may have disturbed relationships between objects. Pretreatment techniques can remove some contaminants more effectively than others. Calibration is required because atmospheric carbon has varied through time. The final result is usually a probability distribution rather than a single exact year. Researchers therefore build chronological models. They combine multiple radiocarbon measurements with the known order of layers, the positions of finds, and assumptions about how deposits formed. At Geisenklösterle, high-precision work pushed the beginning of the Aurignacian sequence back toward 42 or 43,000 years ago. This supported the argument that figurative art and music were present in the Upper Danube region, very early in the arrival of Homo sapiens. It also suggested that these practices may have preceded the harsh climatic episode known as Heinrichstadial IV, rather than appearing only after humans had settled through that disruption. Yet the distinction between the age of a layer and the age of an object remains essential. A fragment found within an early deposit is probably related to that occupation. But archaeology rarely offers perfect sealed moments. Sediment can shift. Animals burrow. Humans disturb older surfaces. Objects may be curated for years before being discarded. A bone used for dating may have entered the layer slightly before or after the flute fragment nearby. Good excavation and modelling reduce these uncertainties, but they do not erase them. The safest wording is that Geissenklösterle preserves some of the earliest securely dated contexts for musical instruments. Not that one particular fragment can be assigned an exact birthday beyond dispute. This is why the title oldest flute in the world changes depending on what is being emphasized. One object may be more complete. Another may come from an older modelled layer. A third may be older still but disputed as an instrument. Hohlefels offers exceptional clarity of form. Geissenklösterle offers exceptional chronological importance. Divje Babe, which will complicate the story later, may be older than both if its perforations were made deliberately, but that interpretation remains contested. A ranking that ignores these differences turns scientific uncertainty into a misleading contest. The same caution applies to the word first. The first surviving fragment is not necessarily the first instrument ever made. It may only be the earliest one found so far, in a region whose cave sediments favoured preservation and whose excavations have been unusually intensive. Elsewhere, instruments made from wood, reed, hide, or fragile bone could have disappeared completely. Even in the Swabian Jura, unknown objects may still lie in unexcavated deposits. Archaeological records are always provisional. A new discovery can move the visible beginning without changing the much older invisible history. What Geissenklösterle does show is that music was not a late ornament added after survival had been secured. Its early dates place instrument making near the beginning of documented Aurignacian life in Central Europe. The people producing these objects were expanding into unfamiliar landscapes, facing climatic instability and maintaining complex technologies. Under those conditions, they also invested in sound. That pattern weakens any simple division between practical adaptation and symbolic behavior. Music may itself have been practical in social terms, helping communities coordinate, remember, identify, or endure. The flute fragments also suggest persistence. A single perforated bone could be an anomaly. Several instruments, made from different materials and recovered from more than one site, point toward repeated practice. At Geissenklösterle, the combination of bird bone and ivory flute fragments shows that makers were using both naturally hollow tubes and laboriously constructed ones. This diversity implies experimentation within a known technological field. People were not merely copying one object. They understood a category of sound-making devices and could approach it through different materials. Scholars still debate where that tradition began. It may have developed locally in the Upper Danube. It may have arrived with Homo sapiens populations moving into Europe. It may have older roots in regions where preservation is poorer or excavation less complete. The evidence cannot currently choose among these possibilities. What survives in the record suggests only that, by the time people occupied Geissenklösterle, musical instrument production was already established enough to leave multiple technical solutions behind. There is also a human tendency to imagine technological progress as a straight-line crude beginnings, gradual improvement, eventual sophistication. The early flutes resist that pattern. The oldest secure examples are already carefully planned and acoustically functional. They do not look like hesitant experiments at the edge of invention. Their competence implies predecessors. Whether those predecessors were earlier flutes, simpler whistles, perishable instruments, or traditions of vocal and rhythmic music that taught people what controlled sound could do. So the debate over age becomes more interesting than a search for a winner. It reveals how archaeologists build time from incomplete evidence, and how easily public language can flatten that work. Hohlefels and Geisenklösterler do not compete for a crown. Together, they define one of the earliest securely visible musical landscapes on Earth. Their fragments tell us that by more than 40,000 years ago, people in the Swabian Jura were not merely producing isolated sounds. They were sustaining a tradition strong enough to survive in several caves, several materials, and several broken objects, each carrying a different piece of the chronology. And behind every date lies an older silence that no laboratory can yet measure directly. Behind that older silence, the evidence begins to repeat itself. One flute could be dismissed as an extraordinary accident, the work of one unusually inventive person, or even a misunderstood object. Several flutes, appearing in different caves, made from different materials, and constructed through different technical solutions, change the scale of the claim. At Hohlefels, Geisenklösterler, and Vogelherd. The fragments do not point toward a single isolated experiment, they point toward a tradition. Tradition is a quiet word, but it carries enormous implications. It means that knowledge survived beyond one act of invention. Someone learned how to choose a suitable bird bone, how to open finger holes without splitting the shaft, how to shape a blowing edge, and how to test the finished instrument by ear. Someone else learned enough to repeat the process. Ivory flutes demanded an even more elaborate sequence, cutting a blank from mammoth tusk, dividing it lengthwise, hollowing matching channels, aligning the halves, sealing the seam, and then creating holes that produced controllable changes in pitch. These procedures were too complex to be rediscovered from nothing every time. They required memory, demonstration, correction, and practice. The archaeological record does not reveal the classroom because there was almost certainly no classroom in the modern sense. Instruction may have happened beside a hearth, during the preparation of materials, or through long observation before a novice was trusted with a valuable bone or ivory blank. Skills might have passed within families, between companions, or through encounters among groups moving along the Danube. There may have been recognized experts, but the evidence does not prove a professional class of musicians or instrument makers. What survives in the record suggests only that technical knowledge circulated well enough to produce related objects across several places. Vogelherd matters in this pattern because it widens the geography of the evidence. The site is famous for its small ivory carvings, but musical fragments from the wider Swabian Jura show that sound making belonged to the same regional world of skilled production. The caves were not identical workshops following a standardized blueprint. Their assemblages differ, and preservation varies greatly. Yet the recurrence of flutes in more than one location weakens the idea that music was a rare curiosity created once and forgotten. It had enough continuity to leave traces across a network of sites. That network may have been social as much as geographical. Aurignacian groups were small, mobile, and dependent on relationships extending beyond a single camp. Raw materials moved. Ornaments carried styles. Stone came from sources that could lie far from the place where tools were discarded. People probably met seasonally, exchanged information, formed partnerships, and renewed alliances. Though the exact organization remains uncertain, a flute could travel within such a network. So could the idea of a flute. An instrument might be copied from another, modified to suit available material, or taught by a visitor whose own group lived beyond the valley. Music itself may have helped maintain those connections. Shared songs or recognizable playing styles could mark belonging without requiring permanent settlement. A melody can be remembered across distance. A rhythm can identify a gathering before every face is visible. This is plausible, but not directly demonstrated by the surviving instruments. No particular tune can be assigned to one group, and no acoustical signature survives that would distinguish communities. Still, instruments are portable cultural objects, and portability matters in a mobile world. The use of several materials adds another clue. Bird bone and mammoth-ivory required different methods. Yet both were used to solve the same broad problem, controlling an air column to create patterned pitch. This suggests that Aurignacian craftspeople understood the concept of a flute beyond one convenient raw material. If a hollow bone was available, they could modify it. If no suitable tube existed, they could manufacture one. The tradition therefore included both replication and innovation. It was stable enough to be recognized, but flexible enough to adapt. Such flexibility makes the search for a single inventor increasingly unhelpful. Modern histories often prefer beginnings with names, dates, and decisive moments. Deep prehistory rarely offers them. The first successful flute may have emerged from many earlier experiments: whistles with no finger holes, short tubes used for calls, reeds that vanished, broken bones that taught makers where cracks would form, and vocal practices that established an appetite for controlled pitch. By the time the Swabian instruments entered cave deposits, the crucial discovery may already have been ancient. Nor can the Swabian Jura safely be called the birthplace of music. It is the region where the earliest secure concentration of sophisticated instruments has been found. But concentration may reflect preservation. Limestone caves protected bone and ivory. Long research traditions brought repeated excavation. Other regions may once have held comparable or older traditions made from materials that decayed or remain undiscovered. Survival can make one landscape look uniquely creative when it may simply be uniquely legible. Even within the Jura, the sample is tiny compared with the number of people who lived there over thousands of years. Most instruments were probably lost outside caves, broken beyond recognition, recycled, or made from substances that vanished. The known flutes are not a complete inventory. They are the durable remainder of a much larger behavioral system. Their rarity today does not necessarily mean they were rare in life. What, then, would a musical tradition have looked like on an ordinary day? Perhaps a player tested a newly opened hole while someone nearby continued scraping hide. Perhaps a flute sounded at the edge of a gathering, not as a formal performance but as part of social life. Perhaps certain instruments were reserved for particular moments. The evidence remains incomplete, and every reconstruction risks making the scene too familiar. Aurignacian people did not divide art, technology, ritual, and entertainment according to modern categories. A single object could move between functions without contradiction. The most defensible conclusion is therefore modest but profound. By the early Aurignacian, people in the Swabian Jura were not merely capable of making music. They had organized knowledge for building instruments through more than one method, in more than one cave, across enough time for variation and repetition to appear. That pattern is culture in one of its clearest archaeological forms, not a solitary flash of genius, but a practice remembered by others. The instruments survive as fragments, yet the tradition behind them must have been whole. It included hands that selected material, eyes that judged spacing, ears that recognized success, and breath trained to turn construction into sound. Somewhere between caves, seasons, and generations, music became something that could be taught. Once that happened, it no longer belonged to one maker. It belonged to a community, and perhaps to many communities connected across the cold valleys of the Ice Age. The community may have carried music across the cold valleys, but the sound itself remains beyond direct recovery. The surviving flutes can be measured, copied, and played, yet none of those actions restores an Aurignacian performance. A replica gives the past a voice. It demonstrates what one reconstruction can produce. It does not tell us which notes were chosen, how long they were held, whether rhythm mattered more than melody, or how listeners understood what they heard. The difference between possible sound and historical sound is the boundary every reconstruction must respect. The first task is to rebuild the instrument. Where an ancient flute survives nearly complete, researchers can record its length, bore, wall thickness, hole diameter, spacing, and blowing edge. Missing sections must still be inferred. A fractured end may once have been longer. A damaged hole may have had a different shape. Warping may have altered the tube after burial. Even the original material can be difficult to reproduce. A modern bird bone from the same species may differ in size. Mammoth-ivory cannot simply be replaced without changing density, texture, and working behavior. Each decision affects the sound that emerges. Once the replica is made, the player introduces another set of variables. The mouth can meet the instrument from several angles. Air can be directed sharply or softly. Finger holes can be fully closed, partly covered, or opened in combinations. Breath pressure can push the instrument into higher registers. The tongue can interrupt airflow. The player can bend pitch, create pulses, or allow tones to dissolve into breath noise. A single flute therefore contains more possibilities than a diagram of 5 holes suggests. Its acoustic range is not identical to the music once made with it. Modern demonstrations often produce clear sequences that sound surprisingly familiar. That familiarity can be misleading. Human ears are quick to organize tones into patterns, and modern performers naturally draw on musical habits learned from contemporary traditions. They may favor equal steps, stable tuning, regular phrases, or recognizable intervals without intending to impose them. Even when a player tries to avoid modern melody, the attempt is still shaped by modern expectations. Experimental performance is most reliable when treated as a test of capability rather than a reconstruction of repertoire. The instruments show that Aurignacian people could control pitch. They do not reveal whether pitch was organized into scales. A series of fingerings may produce a set of notes, but those notes need not have formed a fixed system shared by every player. One performer might use sliding transitions and flexible pitch. Another might emphasize repeated tones. Breath pressure and partial covering could expand or blur the available intervals. The idea of a scale may be useful for measurement, yet it risks suggesting a formal structure the evidence cannot confirm. Rhythm is even more elusive. Flute tones could have been long and sustained, short and percussive, free in timing or bound to a repeated pulse. The instrument might have followed footsteps, hand claps, or bodily movement. It could have accompanied singing, though no vocal line survives. It might have answered another flute, alternated with spoken language, or sounded alone. There is no evidence that ensembles in the modern sense existed, but there is no reason to assume every performance was solitary. The object preserves a melodic possibility while leaving the social arrangement open. Acoustic setting would have changed everything. A flute played near a cave entrance would mix with wind, voices, and movement from the valley. Deeper inside, stone surfaces could reflect and lengthen tones. A narrow passage might strengthen certain frequencies while weakening others. In a large chamber, a note could reach listeners beyond the circle of light. Yet the exact places where the flutes were played are unknown. Finding an instrument in a cave does not prove it was always performed there. It may have been stored, repaired, broken, or discarded in that location after being used elsewhere. The sound level also matters. These instruments were not necessarily faint. A well-made bone flute can project clearly, especially in enclosed space, but loudness depends on breath, bore, and technique. Modern recordings often use microphones that bring the listener close to the instrument and remove surrounding noise. Orination listeners heard sound in real environments filled with fire, conversation, tools, animals, weather, and bodies. The reconstructed note in a studio is acoustically clean in a way Ice Age life rarely was. Timbre, the character that makes one tone feel different from another at the same pitch, is difficult to recover. Bone species, tube shape, surface roughness, seam quality, and blowing method all influence it. An ivory flute may have responded differently from a vulture bone flute, but no claim can be made that one sounded warmer, brighter, or more prestigious. Such descriptions are partly subjective and depend on the replica. What can be said is that orination makers created instruments with distinct physical properties, and those differences likely produced audible variation. There may also have been techniques that modern experimenters have not imagined. Players could have covered the lower end, altered the airstream with the hand, combined voice and flute tone, or used rhythmic breathing. Some possibilities would leave no mark on the object. Ethnographic comparison can suggest ways flutes are played in later societies, but it cannot be transferred directly across 40,000 years. Similar instruments do not guarantee similar music, meanings, or performance rules. This uncertainty does not make reconstruction pointless. On the contrary, it helps define what the archaeological evidence can support. Replicas show that the holes are functional, that the instruments can produce multiple pitches, and that skilled construction creates stable tones. They allow researchers to test how changes in spacing or bore affect sound. They can reveal whether a proposed blowing edge works and whether a reconstructed seam leaks. In that sense, experimental music is part of archaeological method. It turns static measurements into questions. What it cannot do is recover the vanished composition. There is no preserved melody, no rhythm notation, no name for a song, and no record of how emotion was encoded in performance. A rising phrase may have meant nothing special, or it may have carried a social signal. Repetition may have marked ceremony, play, work, mourning, or private practice. No single explanation fully accounts for the possibilities. The most honest reconstruction therefore begins and ends with restraint. A modern player lifts a copied flute, directs breath across an ancient design, and produces tones that could have existed. For a moment, air vibrates through a shape first mastered in the Ice Age. The result is not the return of a lost song. It is a demonstration that such songs were possible, and that the people who made the original instruments possessed a musical world far richer than the fragments can disclose. That richer musical world becomes harder to define when the evidence grows older and more ambiguous. In a cave called Divje Babe in present-day Slovenia, archaeologists recovered a fragment of cave bear femur pierced by several openings. The object came from a Middle Paleolithic context and has often been dated to roughly 50,000 or 60,000 years ago, if those holes were deliberately made and used to control sound. The object would predate the secure Aurignacian flutes of the Swabian Jura by many millennia. It might even suggest that Neanderthals made wind instruments. But this possibility stands at the centre of one of the most persistent disputes in the archaeology of music. At first glance, the fragment invites comparison with a flute. Two complete holes and portions of additional openings run along the bone. Their arrangement can look intentional, especially when viewed beside later perforated instruments. Researchers who support the musical interpretation argue that the spacing permits playable notes, that some damage may reflect manufacture, and that reconstructed versions can produce controlled tones. The National Museum of Slovenia presents it as a Neanderthal flute, and experimental musicians have demonstrated ways in which a copy can be played. Yet an object can produce sound without having been made to do so. Bone pierced by carnivore teeth may also whistle when blown, and a modern reconstruction can become playable because the researcher completes missing areas according to a musical hypothesis. The central question is therefore not whether a copy can sound. It is whether the original perforations were created by deliberate human action rather than by the jaws of an animal. Critics have compared the holes with damage found on cave bear bones accumulated by hyenas and other carnivores. Powerful teeth can puncture cortical bone, leaving rounded openings, fractures, and opposing marks. In this view, the Divje Babe fragment may be the remains of feeding rather than music. The spacing that appears flute-like could be coincidental, selected from a much larger population of damaged bones, because it resembles an instrument to modern eyes. Some researchers have also questioned whether the surrounding marks show the scraping, drilling, or repeated tool motion expected from manufacture. Supporters respond that no single carnivore scenario explains every feature comfortably. They point to the location and alignment of the holes, the absence or interpretation of certain opposing tooth marks, and microscopic traces that may indicate human modification. Experimental work has attempted to reproduce both possibilities, perforating bone with stone tools and puncturing comparable bones through carnivore action. These studies have not ended the dispute. Different teams emphasize different fractures, different reconstructions, and different standards for what counts as decisive evidence. The bone itself has also changed since deposition. It is incomplete, cracked, and affected by processes that occurred in sediment. Missing portions make the original number and dimensions of openings uncertain. A hole that looks circular today may have been enlarged by breakage. A fracture may have started during manufacture, chewing, trampling, or later pressure. Archaeologists are therefore interpreting a damaged object whose most informative surfaces are not all preserved. The evidence remains incomplete, and certainty tends to increase only when the object is simplified for public display. Its archaeological context adds importance, but not an automatic answer. The Middle Paleolithic layers of Divje Babe are associated with Neanderthals, and the fragment was found among cave bear remains and stone tools. If the object was modified by humans, Neanderthals are the most likely makers, but association alone cannot prove that every altered bone in the deposit was a tool. Caves were occupied by animals and humans at different times, and their traces became mixed within complex sedimentary histories. The debate matters because it intersects with an older tendency to underestimate Neanderthal behaviour. For much of modern scholarship, Neanderthals were portrayed as culturally limited, incapable of symbolism, art, or complex communication. Discoveries of pigments, ornaments, carefully prepared tools, adhesive technologies, and possible engravings have weakened that caricature. Genetic evidence has also shown that they were not a failed humanity entirely separate from modern people. It is therefore reasonable to consider that Neanderthals may have made music. It is not reasonable to treat one disputed bone as final proof. The opposite error is equally serious. Skepticism about Divje Babe does not require returning to the image of Neanderthals as silent or unimaginative. Their voices, bodies, and social lives could support song, rhythm, and patterned sound without leaving a durable instrument. If the bone is carnivore damaged, the broader possibility of Neanderthal music remains open. Absence of a confirmed flute is not evidence of absence of musicality. Experimental replicas must be interpreted in the same way. A copy that produces a scale shows that a bone with those dimensions can function as an aerophone. It does not show that the original was played with the same mouth position, fingering, or restored length. If missing sections are reconstructed differently, the available pitches change. If the holes were made by teeth, their accidental spacing can still permit modern performance. Playability is evidence worth considering, but it is not a signature of intention. The disagreement also reveals how archaeologists identify tools. Secure artifacts usually preserve a cluster of mutually supporting clues: standardized form, repeated examples, manufacturing marks, wear traces, appropriate context, and experimental replication. The Aurignacian flutes satisfy several of these conditions. They have shaped blowing edges, carefully opened finger holes, selected raw materials, and parallels across multiple sites. Divje Babe is singular and damaged. Its interpretation depends heavily on features that can be read in more than one way. No verdict can restore the missing behavior. Perhaps a Neanderthal craftsperson selected a cave bear bone and made an instrument whose sound preceded the Swabian flutes by thousands of years. Perhaps a carnivore punctured the bone, and modern observers recognized a flute in an accidental pattern. The object remains suspended between these histories. That uncertainty is not a failure of archaeology. It is a precise description of what the evidence can bear. Divje Babe marks the edge between possibility and proof, reminding us that the oldest history of music will not always arrive in clean, unmistakable form. Sometimes the past leaves an instrument. Sometimes it leaves only a bone with holes, and the silence around it becomes part of the story. The silence around Divje Babe points toward a larger problem. Most prehistoric music was probably made from things that could never survive for 50,000 years. Archaeology gives special attention to bone and ivory because they endure, not necessarily because they dominated musical life. The oldest visible instruments are therefore not a complete sample of the oldest sounds. They are the survivors of an enormous filtering process in which decay, weather, soil chemistry, fire, scavenging, reuse, and chance removed nearly everything else. A drum stretched with hide over a wooden frame could have produced a deep, carrying pulse, yet both hide and wood are vulnerable. Moisture swells them, fungi consume them, insects tunnel through them, dry conditions split them. Unless such an object entered an unusually protective environment, it would disappear long before an archaeologist arrived. The same is true of rattles made from gourds, bark containers, seeds, shells bound with fibre, or small stones enclosed in woven material. A complete musical tradition could leave behind only loose pebbles that no one would recognize as part of an instrument. Wooden clappers, beaters, whistles, and slit drums would be equally difficult to identify. Wood occasionally survives in waterlogged, frozen, or oxygen-poor settings, but most Ice Age camps were exposed to cycles of wetting, drying, burial, and erosion. A carefully shaped stick may decay completely. A less damaged fragment may resemble ordinary fuel or construction material. Even when wood survives, proving that it was used musically can be difficult because the same form might serve several purposes. An object struck rhythmically does not acquire a unique mark announcing that it was an instrument. Reeds and hollow plant stems offer another invisible possibility. They can be turned into whistles or pipes with relatively little modification. Some may require only cutting, trimming, and opening holes, yet such materials vanish rapidly. A reed flute could predate the Swabian bone instruments by thousands of years and leave no trace. This does not mean that reed instruments definitely existed in the Middle Paleolithic or earlier. It means that the archaeological record is structurally unable to test the possibility in most environments. Strings are even more elusive. Twisted sinew, gut, hair, or plant fiber could be stretched, plucked, or attached to resonating bodies. But these materials almost never survive from deep prehistory. The discovery of cordage or fiber technology at ancient sites shows that humans and other hominins could manipulate strands, but it does not automatically prove stringed instruments. A bow may produce a tone when plucked, yet whether hunting bows were deliberately used musically in the Ice Age remains unknown. Similarity in potential sound is not evidence of historical use. Then there is the body, the instrument that leaves no artifact at all. Singing requires no manufactured object. Neither do humming, chanting, whistling, clapping, thigh slapping, chest tapping, or stamping. A group can create complex rhythm with nothing more than coordinated movement. Breath can be controlled, repeated, layered, and answered. Voices can alternate or merge. One person can establish a pulse while another moves against it. None of this need leave a durable trace unless it occurs in a context where footprints, floor wear, or unusual spatial arrangements survive, and even then the musical interpretation would remain uncertain. This preservation problem changes how the 40,000-year story should be understood. The secure flutes do not mark the beginning of music. They mark the point at which some forms of music entered durable matter. Their appearance may reflect technological innovation, but it may equally reflect the first surviving expression of practices that had long existed through voice, gesture, and perishable materials. What survives in the record suggests a developed musical capacity, not an abrupt awakening. Human anatomy does not provide a simple date either. The vocal tract, breath control, auditory system, and neural mechanisms involved in timing evolved through long histories with many functions. Language, emotional communication, imitation, movement, and social attention all overlap with musical behavior. Fossils can reveal aspects of hearing or anatomy, but they cannot show whether a population sang in coordinated groups. Genetic evidence can identify changes related to speech and neural development, but no single music gene separates silence from melody. Musicality is a distributed capacity, built from systems that did not evolve for one purpose alone. Comparisons with other animals help define some of those components. Chimpanzee drumming shows that patterned percussion and population-level variation can occur outside humans. Birds learn complex vocal sequences, whales repeat long, changing patterns, gibbons produce coordinated calls. Yet these examples do not provide a ladder leading directly toward human music. Each species has its own evolutionary history. The cautious lesson is that rhythm, vocal learning, repetition, and display have deep biological roots. While the human combination of these capacities became unusually flexible and socially pervasive, the archaeological silence also encourages bias toward melody, because flutes preserve pitch-producing technology. Rhythm may have been equally important or more important, but percussion instruments are less likely to survive or be recognized. A bone tube with finger holes clearly invites acoustic testing. A worn stone struck against another stone may be indistinguishable from an ordinary tool. A wooden surface used for communal drumming may leave nothing. The visible record may therefore exaggerate the role of wind instruments, simply because their construction is easier to identify. Even musical spaces can vanish. Open-air gatherings leave fewer traces than caves. Sound produced beside a river, on a seasonal route, or near a temporary camp disperses without marking the landscape. Archaeologists may recover hearths and tool debris while missing the behavior that surrounded them. A site interpreted as a workshop or hunting camp may also have been filled with singing. Functional labels describe excavated remains, not the full texture of life. A dance may leave a compacted surface or a cluster of footprints, but movement alone does not prove music accompanied it. The rhythm may have existed only in muscles, shared glances, and anticipated steps, disappearing when the gathering ended. And yet that silence is not emptiness. It is a reminder that absence in archaeology often reflects fragility rather than non-existence. The vanished majority of prehistoric music probably lived in breath, skin, wood, fibre, movement, and memory. Bone flutes survived because mineralized tissue endured where songs could not. They stand at the edge of a much larger soundscape, preserving not the first music, but the first music time failed to erase completely. The music time failed to erase completely survives as objects, but sound also belongs to places. A flute does not behave the same way in open air, under a shelter, beside a river, or deep inside limestone. Walls reflect vibration. Narrow passages filter it. Domed ceilings lengthen some tones and scatter others. A voice that seems ordinary outside can become enlarged underground, returning from several directions after the singer has stopped. For people who entered Ice Age caves with small flames and limited sight, this transformation could hardly have gone unnoticed. The study of such effects is called archaeoacoustics. It asks how sound behaved at archaeological sites, and whether acoustic properties influenced where people gathered, painted, performed, or carried out other activities. The field combines archaeology with acoustics, architecture, digital modelling, and experimental reconstruction. Researchers may clap, burst balloons, use loudspeakers, or produce controlled signals while microphones record the response of a cave. The resulting measurements describe reverberation, echo delay, resonance, clarity, and the way sound changes from one location to another. One common method records an impulse response. A short, sharp sound is produced, and instruments capture what the space does to it. The direct sound arrives first. Reflections follow from nearby walls, ceilings, floors, and passages. In a complex cave, the pattern can be dense and irregular. Researchers can then use that response to simulate how a voice, flute, drum, or other sound might have been heard at the same point. This does not recreate an ancient performance. It reconstructs the acoustic behavior of the space under present conditions. That qualification matters. Caves change, sediment accumulates or erodes, entrances collapse, moisture, temperature, and vegetation alter surfaces. Modern walkways, barriers, and excavation trenches can affect sound. A chamber that seems enclosed today may have been more open in the Paleolithic, or the reverse. Even the presence of people would absorb sound differently from an empty room. Measurements are therefore models of possibility, not perfect recordings of the past. Still, some results are striking. Certain decorated caves and rock art sites contain places where echoes are unusually strong, where particular frequencies resonate, or where sound travels farther than expected. In some studies, concentrations of images appear near acoustically distinctive zones. This has encouraged the idea that sound and image may sometimes have been experienced together. A painted animal illuminated by a flickering lamp could seem to shift on the wall while a voice or instrument returned through the chamber. The effect would be physical moving light changes perception, and reflected sound changes spatial awareness. Yet correlation is not proof of purpose. A resonant chamber may also be wide enough for people to stand, dry enough to preserve pigment, or accessible enough to decorate. Artists may have chosen it for visual reasons rather than acoustic ones. The same geological features that create echoes may also create smooth surfaces. Scholars still debate how often acoustics influenced Paleolithic activity, and no single pattern appears in every cave. It would be misleading to call all decorated caves concert halls, temples, or theatres. The Swabian Jura adds another layer because instruments were found in caves, but even here the evidence remains indirect. A flute recovered from a cave deposit may have been played inside, near the entrance, or somewhere else entirely. It might have broken during performance, manufacture, or transport. Its presence shows that musical technology entered the cave, not that every chamber had a defined performance function. The temptation to imagine formal concerts in Hohle Fells must be resisted because modern categories can make prehistory look more familiar than it was. If music did sound inside these caves, the performer would have interacted with darkness as much as with echo. A small lamp reveals only a limited area. A torch throws shifting shadows and may create smoke. The player may not see everyone listening. Sound can cross the border of light, reaching bodies hidden beyond immediate vision. In such conditions, the source of a note can feel uncertain. A reflection may seem to come from the wall or from deeper passageways. The cave becomes not merely a container for music, but an active participant in how music is perceived. Low frequencies and sharp attacks would behave differently. A clap or stamp could produce a clear return. A sustained flute tone might merge with its reflections. A voice could be understood close to the source but become blurred farther away. Certain pitches might grow stronger because they align with chamber dimensions, while others fade quickly. Performers who returned repeatedly could learn these effects without formal measurement. They might adjust tempo, volume, or position through experience, just as people today change their voices in a cathedral, tunnel, or empty room. The social consequences could be significant. Shared sound in darkness narrows attention. Repetition helps a group anticipate what comes next. Echo enlarges a single performer, while reverberation blends several voices into a less individual sound. These effects could support ritual, storytelling, play, mourning, teaching, or simple experimentation. No one explanation fully accounts for why people might have valued them. Prehistoric people did not need to separate sacred sound from everyday sound in the way modern analysis often does. Archaeoacoustics also has limits beyond preservation. Researchers choose where to measure, which signals to use, and which acoustic qualities to emphasize. A location may seem remarkable only compared with nearby points selected for testing. Statistical patterns can change depending on how images are counted or grouped. Modern listeners may prefer long reverberation because they associate it with grandeur, while Ice Age communities may have valued clarity, sudden echoes, or other effects. The field is most reliable when it identifies measurable properties and least reliable when it leaps directly from those properties to beliefs. Recent methodological work has tried to make such studies more consistent by defining how impulse responses should be collected at rock art sites. Standardized procedures allow results from different caves to be compared more carefully. Large reviews have also shifted attention away from spectacular claims toward the broader study of past soundscapes, how people listened, moved, signaled, worked, and remembered through sound. This perspective is useful because music rarely exists alone. It shares space with speech, footsteps, tools, animals, wind, and water. The cave, then, was not necessarily an instrument in the literal sense, but it could transform every instrument brought inside. It could stretch a note, multiply a clap, confuse direction, and carry a voice beyond sight. The people of the Ice Age may have used these effects deliberately, or they may simply have lived with them as part of the cave's character. What survives does not settle the matter. It does something subtler. It reminds us that ancient music was never only a sequence of notes. It was breath moving through a material object, then moving again through stone. Stone can transform sound, but the deeper question is why people would repeatedly invest effort in making sound together at all. A flute requires material, time, and skill. A song requires attention. A group that stops to sing, play, stamp, or clap is doing something that does not immediately cut meat, sharpen a blade, or build shelter. Yet music appears so widely in human life that treating it as a useless ornament explains very little. The challenge is not to identify one purpose and declare the problem solved. It is to understand why patterned sound became useful in several ways at once. One influential idea is coordination. Rhythm allows bodies to anticipate one another. When people move to a shared pulse, timing becomes easier to predict. This can support walking, carrying, rowing, working, or other repeated tasks. Into the Ice Age, coordinated motion may have helped groups travel, process food, maintain tools, or perform tasks requiring more than one person. The evidence does not show ordination work songs, and it would be careless to invent them. But the general principle is secure rhythm can reduce uncertainty between moving bodies. Coordination can become social even when no practical task is underway. Moving together creates a temporary sense of unity. Modern experiments show that synchronized action can increase feelings of affiliation and cooperation. Such findings cannot be projected directly onto people living 40,000 years ago, yet they offer a plausible mechanism. Small mobile communities depended on trust beyond the narrowest family circle. Seasonal gatherings, exchanges, partnerships, and alliances would all benefit from activities that made strangers or acquaintances feel more closely aligned. Music could help produce that alignment because it organizes attention in real time. This leads to the idea of music as a social instrument. Unlike a tool held by one person, a musical pattern can be shared simultaneously. A pulse belongs to everyone who follows it. A refrain can be remembered by many people without being divided among them. Participation can blur the boundary between performer and listener. Some people may lead, but the sound exists through coordinated expectation. In that sense, Music can scale emotion and memory across a group more efficiently than solitary speech. Identity may have been another function. A community can recognize itself through familiar patterns of sound. Certain rhythms, melodic contours, instruments, or performance styles might distinguish one group from another. There is no surviving Eynan repertoire to prove such distinctions, but portable instruments fit naturally within mobile identity. A flute could cross valleys while carrying a recognizable manner of playing. Sound heard before a group became visible might signal belonging, invitation, warning, or simply presence. The meaning would depend on context now lost. Music also supports memory. Repetition and rhythm make sequences easier to retain. Information attached to melody can become more stable than ordinary speech when groups rehearse it together. Ice Age communities relied on memory for routes, seasons, animal behavior, kinship, obligations, and stories. It is tempting to imagine songs encoding all of these, but the evidence does not allow specific claims. What can be said is that music offers a powerful framework for preserving and transmitting ordered information without writing. Ritual is often proposed as well. Patterned sound can mark a boundary between ordinary and exceptional time. Repetition narrows attention. Sudden silence can heighten expectation. Echo, darkness, firelight, and coordinated movement can make an event feel set apart. Archaeologists therefore often consider music in relation to ceremony, burial, initiation, healing, or myth. Yet ritual can become a label applied whenever an object lacks an obvious practical use. No flute from the Swabian Jura comes with evidence identifying a specific ceremony. Ritual remains possible, but not demonstrable as the universal purpose of Ice Age music. Emotional regulation may be easier to defend in general terms. Music can calm, energize, intensify grief, support endurance, or transform fear into shared attention. These effects arise from predictable timing, repetition, vocal tone, and collective participation. In harsh environments, emotional stability is not separate from survival. A group that can restore calm after danger, maintain morale during movement, or give form to mourning may function more effectively. Still, no single emotional use explains why complex instruments were made. The same flute could serve different moods on different days. Caregiving has also entered discussions of musical evolution. Human infants require prolonged protection, and caregivers often use soft, repetitive, exaggerated vocal patterns. Such communication can regulate attention and emotion before language is fully understood. This does not mean the first music was a lullaby, nor does it allow any direct claim about Eynan parenting. It does suggest that musicality may have deep roots in safe, close social interaction, where timing, pitch, and repetition carry meaning without formal words. Sexual selection offers another hypothesis. Musical skill can display breath control, memory, coordination, creativity, and confidence. A capable performer may attract attention or signal competence. Darwin considered such possibilities, and later researchers have explored them in different forms, but music is too widely embedded in collective life to be reduced to courtship. A trait can serve attraction, while also supporting bonding, ritual, memory, and play. Evolution often preserves behaviors because they work across several contexts. Play itself should not be ignored. Humans explore patterns because patterns are engaging. Repeating a sound, varying it, surprising listeners, or imitating an animal can be pleasurable without serving a narrow adaptive goal. The division between useful and enjoyable may be false. Pleasure encourages repetition, and repetition can build skill, cohesion, and memory. A practice may persist because people value the experience directly, while its social effects accumulate around that value. The 2025 work emphasizing collective musical activity, prediction, and coordinated movement strengthens the idea that music operates through shared timing. Yet such research examines modern humans and theoretical models, not Ice Age performances. It can explain how music may work, but not which function mattered most beside a hearth at Hold Fells. The evidence remains incomplete because the flutes preserve technology, not intention. No single explanation fully accounts for the labour invested in instruments, the likely presence of vocal and bodily music, the portability of sound, and its persistence across human societies, coordination, identity, memory, ritual, care, emotion, attraction, and play may all have contributed. The important point is that music was not separate from social life. It could organize bodies, feelings, and expectations at once. A flute in the Ice Age was therefore more than a tube producing pitch. It was a device for creating shared time. Breath entered alone, but sound emerged into a group. Listeners could anticipate, respond, move, remember, or remain silent. The note vanished immediately, yet for its brief duration it aligned people who otherwise occupied separate bodies. That fleeting alignment may be one reason music endured, even when nearly every physical trace of it did not. The shared time created by music did not remain bound to bone flutes or to the first Aurignacian communities of the Swabian Jura. More than 20,000 years later, another instrument entered the archaeological record in a different form. At Marsoulas cave in southwestern France, researchers identified a large seashell deliberately modified so that human breath could turn it into sound. The object is roughly 18,000 years old. It shows that Paleolithic people could transform the spiral architecture of a shell into a powerful wind instrument. The shell belonged to a large sea snail and had travelled far from the coast before reaching the cave. Its presence implies movement, exchange, or the transport of valued material across considerable distance. The outer tip, or apex, had been removed, creating an opening where a player could direct air. Researchers also identified modifications around the natural opening and traces suggesting that a mouthpiece may once have been fitted. The object was not simply a shell that happened to whistle when blown. Its form had been altered for deliberate acoustic use. For decades, however, its musical function was not fully recognized. Archaeological collections often contain objects whose purpose becomes visible only when new questions are asked. A shell may first be catalogued as ornament, container, symbolic object, or raw material. Only later can imaging, microscopic examination, and experimental performance reveal a different history. At Marsoulas, computed tomography helped researchers study the interior without damaging it. The scans showed modifications supporting the interpretation of the shell as an aerophone. When a trained horn player tested the instrument, it produced several clear, resonant pitches. The sound was low, forceful, and carrying, unlike the lighter tone associated with the bone flute. This established that the shell could function as a horn. It did not recover the exact technique of the Magdalenian player, because the original mouthpiece is missing and modern performance depends on reconstruction. Even so, the result demonstrated that Paleolithic music included instruments capable of very different acoustic effects. A shell horn works through vibrating lips, much like later brass instruments, rather than by directing air across an edge as in a flute. The player must control pressure, lip tension, and breath to make the air inside the shell resonate. Different modes can produce different pitches, though the instrument offers no row of finger holes. Skill lies in the body as much as in the object. The player shapes sound through muscles that leave no trace, reminding us that instruments preserve only part of musical technique. The Marsoulas shell also bears pigment markings. Red material appears on portions of its surface, and researchers have noted relationships between these markings and the painted imagery inside the cave. Marsoulas contains engraved and painted animals, including bison and horses, as well as geometric signs. The possibility that the shell's decoration connected it to the cave's visual world is compelling, yet no single explanation fully accounts for the association. Pigment may have marked ownership, identity, ritual importance, aesthetic value, or something modern categories fail to capture. It is tempting to imagine the horn sounding beneath the painted walls, its low notes rolling through the chamber while firelight moved across animal figures. Such a scene is plausible, but it remains a reconstruction. The shell was found in the cave, and the cave contains art. Yet neither fact proves a formal performance linking the two. The instrument could have been played outside, carried during movement, used for signalling, or brought into the cave only on particular occasions. Archaeology preserves proximity more readily than intention. Experiments allow researchers to ask how such sound might have behaved. A loud, sustained tone can activate reflections that a quiet voice does not. In enclosed limestone space, the horn may have seemed to come from more than one direction as echoes returned. A low note could travel beyond the lamp's light, reaching listeners before the player became visible. Whether this effect was valued deliberately is uncertain, but people familiar with the cave would have learned its response through experience. The instrument may also have served beyond music as narrowly defined. Shell horns in later societies have been used for communication, ceremony, assembly, maritime signaling, warfare, and display. These comparisons show what such an object can do, not what the Marsoulas shell definitely did. Its loudness made long-distance signaling possible, but its pigment and cave context may suggest meanings beyond utility. Function need not have been singular. A horn can call people together and then become part of what happens after they arrive. Its coastal origin adds another social dimension. Transporting a large shell inland required access to distant regions or exchange networks connecting communities across the landscape. Yet it may also have been one of many shells that once circulated, most of which did not survive or were not modified acoustically. The evidence remains incomplete, and rarity in the record cannot be equated automatically with rarity in life. Compared with the Swabian flutes, the Marsoulas horn represents continuity and transformation. The basic principle remains ancient. Breath enters a modified natural form and emerges as organized sound. But the material, playing method, volume, and performance possibilities are different. Paleolithic music was not one frozen tradition lasting unchanged for 20,000 years. Communities experimented with bone, ivory, shell, and almost certainly many vanished materials. Musical knowledge diversified as people moved through changing environments and social worlds. The shell also warns against telling the history of music as a straight march toward modern instruments. A horn is not more advanced than a flute, and a later date does not make its music more complex. Different instruments solve different social and acoustic problems. The Marsoulas object could project powerfully across space, While a flute offered fine control over melodic pitch, neither reveals musical sophistication by itself. Complexity may lie in performance, coordination, memory, and meaning rather than in the number of holes or notes. What survives suggests that by the Magdalenian period, sound-making remained entangled with movement, image, material, and place. The shell crossed landscapes. Pigment connected it to visible signs. Breath awakened its spiral chamber. Stone returned the note as echo. Still, the precise event has vanished. We do not know whether its tone announced a gathering, accompanied painted imagery, marked a transition, imitated an animal, or explored the pleasure of resonance. After 18,000 years, the shell can sound again, but its message cannot. Modern breath enters an ancient object and produces a tone that is physically real, yet historically incomplete. The note proves capability, not meaning. It reminds us that prehistoric instruments were not silent symbols. They were devices built to act upon air, bodies, and distance. The Marsoulas horn extends the surviving music of the Ice Age from the delicate voice of hollow bone to the deep call of the sea carried far inland. The deep call carried inland by the Marsoula shell was not the final surviving experiment in prehistoric sound. Thousands of years later, near the shores of an ancient lake in the Levant, another set of instruments reveals how carefully humans could imitate the voices of the living world. At Eynan-Mallaha, also known as Eynan-Mallaha, archaeologists recovered 7 small aerophones made from bird bones. They belong to the final Natufian period, more than 12,000 years ago, when communities in the region were living through profound changes in settlement, subsistence, and social organization. These objects are far younger than the Aurignacian flutes, but they preserve a different musical idea, not simply controlling pitch, but shaping sound to resemble the calls of birds of prey. The instruments were made from the wing bones of small waterfowl. That choice was deliberate. Larger bird bones would have created deeper tones, yet the narrow tubes of these smaller species produced higher, sharper sounds. Researchers identified carefully worked openings and microscopic traces consistent with manufacture and use. When experimental replicas were played, they generated calls similar in acoustic character to those of raptors found in the region. The resemblance does not prove that every performance was intended as exact imitation, but it is strong enough to suggest that the makers selected material with a particular sonic result in mind. This is a different kind of evidence from a flute reconstructed mainly for its melodic range. The Eynan-Mallaha aerophones may have been whistles, calls, signaling devices, musical instruments, or objects that crossed all of those categories. A short piercing sound could attract attention across a settlement. It might imitate a bird during hunting, accompany a gathering, mark identity, or take part in ritual performance. Scholars still debate their principal function because the same sound can serve several purposes. A bird call copied by a human can be practical and symbolic at once. The Natufian communities who made them occupied a world unlike that of the earliest Aurignacian settlers in the upper Danube. Some groups established substantial settlements, built stone structures, harvested wild cereals, hunted gazelle and other animals, and maintained complex networks before the full development of agriculture. Yet music did not emerge here as a new consequence of settled life. The much older flutes had already shown that musical instrument traditions flourished among mobile hunter-gatherers. What Eynan-Mallaha adds is continuity through change. As human lifeways shifted, sound remained part of how people engaged with animals, places, and one another. Birds run quietly through the entire story. Vulture and swan bones became flutes in the Swabian Jura. Small waterfowl bones became high-pitched aerophones in the Levant. In 2026, 2 mammoth-ivory bird figurines were announced from Hohle Fells, adding new images of birds to the same symbolic landscape that preserved some of the earliest secure instruments. It is tempting to draw a direct line between carved birds, bird bone flutes, and attention to birdsong. Such a connection is possible, but the evidence does not prove it. The raw material may have been chosen for its hollow structure, while the figurines may have carried entirely different meanings. Still, the repeated human attention to birds is difficult to ignore. They moved through the air, produced patterned calls, migrated with seasons, and occupied a realm humans could watch but not enter unaided. Imitation may have been one bridge between those worlds. Humans can copy animal calls with the voice, whistle, or instrument. Such sounds can lure, signal, teach, entertain, or evoke an animal without its physical presence. The Eynan-Mallaha pipes demonstrate that prehistoric craftspeople deliberately shaped tubes capable of producing a raptor-like register. Whether the sound was used to deceive birds, communicate between people, or summon associations within ceremony remains unresolved. No single explanation fully accounts for the objects, and their archaeological context does not preserve a performance. Their discovery also shows how easily musical evidence can be overlooked. Tiny worked bones may be classified as tools, ornaments, or unidentified fragments until microscopic study and acoustic testing reveal their potential. Prehistoric music may therefore remain hidden within existing collections as well as unexcavated ground. Some objects can never be recognized because use left no distinctive trace. Others may produce sound accidentally, requiring researchers to distinguish intentional design from modern experimentation. The Eynan-Mallaha aerophones are persuasive because material choice, perforation, manufacture, and acoustic results support one another. Across the long arc from Hohle Fells to Marsoulas and Eynan-Mallaha, there is no single line of technological progress. The instruments vary in form, material, playing method, and probable purpose. A 5-holed flute can shape a sequence of pitches. A shell horn can project a powerful call. A small bird bone pipe can imitate a raptor. Each transforms breath differently. Together, they show that prehistoric people did not discover one musical solution and repeat it unchanged. They explored the acoustic properties of the world around them and built instruments suited to different effects. The same arc also resists the idea that music belongs only to leisure created after material needs have been satisfied. These objects appear among communities facing cold, mobility, ecological uncertainty, and later major changes in settlement. Their makers invested in sound because sound mattered. It could organize attention, carry across space, connect bodies in time, imitate animals, strengthen memory, or mark occasions that ordinary speech could not contain. Which of these mattered most probably changed from one performance to another. What the instruments do not preserve is equally important. They do not reveal the names of the players. They do not tell us whether skill brought admiration or responsibility. They do not preserve the faces of listeners, the pattern of movement around a hearth, or the emotions attached to a familiar phrase. They do not show whether a melody belonged to one person, one family, one valley, or a network extending across regions. Material evidence preserves the frame of sound while leaving experience outside it. Their enduring importance lies in this combination of technical precision and social openness. The objects define what was possible while refusing to disclose one fixed purpose. By roughly 40,000 years ago, and perhaps several millennia earlier, humans were already making sophisticated musical instruments. Over the following millennia, they continued to shape bone, ivory, and shell into devices that controlled air and attention. Yet the history that survives is not a continuous score. It is a set of isolated notes separated by immense silence. Each discovery makes the silence more intelligible without filling it completely. The final mystery is not whether prehistoric people made music. It is how much of their human world was carried through music and vanished when the last listener who remembered it was gone. And so the story returns to breath. Before bone was drilled, before ivory was split and sealed, before a shell was opened to the air, music may already have lived in the body. A voice rose, another answered, hands found a pulse, and for a moment separate lives moved together. Nothing of that moment needed to survive for it to matter. We can approach that silence gently, without forcing it to answer. The surviving fragments do not ask us to invent a melody for them. They ask only that we notice the care with which they were made, the patience behind each opening, and the human wish to give breath a form that others could share. The caves remain, the bones remain, the carved birds rest beneath museum light, far from the cold valleys where their makers watched real wings cross the sky. Replicas can sound again, and microphones can preserve every vibration, but the ancient meaning does not return with the note. The air is different, the listeners are different. The memory that once completed the music is gone. Perhaps that is why these instruments feel so intimate. A stone tool records pressure from the hand. A flute records the shape of breath. Its holes wait for fingers that disappeared tens of thousands of years ago. Its hollow body is an absence designed to become sound, and silence is what time has placed inside it. Far beyond the firelight of the Swabian caves, winters passed, rivers changed course, animals migrated, and communities carried their knowledge onward. Songs altered as people moved. Some were forgotten. Others may have survived in transformed patterns for generations before vanishing without trace. No archive marked their disappearance. There was only a final performance that no one knew was final. Now the instruments lie still again. The vulture bow no longer holds warm breath. The mammoth-ivory carries no sealed column of air. The Marsoulas shell keeps the curve of an ancient sea, and the small pipes of Eynan-Mallaha preserve the possibility of a bird's cry. Around them stretches the immense quiet of prehistory. Yet that quiet is not empty. It contains every lost rhythm the earth could not preserve, every voice that ended in open air, and every gathering held together briefly by sound. Music survived not as a complete song, but as evidence that people reached toward one another across darkness, and somewhere in that darkness, beneath stone and stars, the Ice Age was singing.